Welcome back to another Boxscore Geek show. I'm your host, Dre Alvarez, found most places as Nerd Numbers. With me, as always, is my producer, voice of God, man of many hats, Brian Foster. And Brian, we have returned despite the fact that you are blurry.
I'm blurry.
It's fine because the Denver Nuggets have won an NBA title. And Brian, there's a few things. Old us gets to be so right and so wrong simultaneously. I'm comfortable with it. And newer me gets to be so right, which we'll get to discuss really quickly. So as a quick reminder, we predicted the Denver Nuggets would win in 5. You specifically. And I mean, your logic, I think you said you copied Andrew Sutton, who correctly called the conference finals. And I'm much nicer as a grader, I have found, than you, where he basically said Lakers in 4, Heat in 6. Now, what was funny is, like, he said Lakers in 4, like all of his logic said Lakers in 4. This is Andrew. And then he basically said, but I got to say Lakers in 5. And but then I talked to him a little bit and I was like, well, that's not the title of the show. The title of the show, for what it was worth, was Lakers in 4, Lakers in 7. It was a very Bayesian set of logic. He was basically like, either the Nuggets, who are on a roll, are going to crush the spirit of the Lakers and plow onto an NBA Finals, which they did, which was awesome, or LeBron James, like, resilience is going to pull it out for the Lakers, which had happened all playoffs. And luckily for us, both kind of ended up being true. LeBron's spirit wasn't broken. In game 4, he put up a 40 spot. He was the best player in the game. He was better than all of the players in the game combined, with the annoying caveat that more of the bad players in the game were on his team than on the Nuggets. So basically, the Nuggets didn't win because Jokic outstarred LeBron. The Nuggets won because the Lakers they had more bad players on the Lakers than the Nuggets had bad players, which just is what it is. So Nuggets go on to the NBA Finals. You say you think you took what Andrew had predicted as a result too, because he did correctly call that the finals was going to be Nuggets Heat. You said Nuggets in 5. And I'll give a tremendous amount of respect to the Heat because they took one at home from the Nuggets. Which is just, an amazing accomplishment. The Miami Heat, en route to a runner-up performance, managed to beat the Boston Celtics in a Game 7 away. They beat the Celtics in the Garden in a must-win situation in the playoffs. That is, for what it's worth, if you're a fan of NBA history, that is like unheard of. That does not happen. And then they took the Nuggets at home. And I mean, I remembered this watching it, like, the Nuggets hadn't been defeated at home since March. So they went, over a month without losing in the Pepsi Ball Arena, now formerly the Pepsi Center. If Nikola Jokic suited up and the Nuggets were at home, it was, you just check it off. It was a win, right? And the Miami Heat managed to steal one. Now, I mean, like, the Nuggets were up like 15 points at one point, but then, Nuggets in 5, which is what you called. And just to give you a rundown of the topics before we talk more about the NBA Finals, we're going to be talking the NBA Finals, what we're talking about right now. Of course, the Chris Paul trades and even some articles I've written, Brian. I'm back to writing articles. Austin Reeves and the stupidity of the salary cap in the NBA. And, oh, that's funny. And then the NBA draft and some trades related to that. But back to the finals. The good news, Brian, is I was able to go and see the Nuggets win their only NBA championship ever over Father's Day week. And I had a 3 generation, myself, my son, my brother, my dad. We all got to see it together. Now, the funny thing, we were talking this pre-show, is that was without doubt one of the worst games I have ever seen. If you look at, like, the stats on NBA.com, like the charts, the Nuggets were trailing most of the game. And this has gotten to be something ridiculously weird about Jimmy Butler's history, Brian. So Jimmy Butler, the Nuggets finally take the lead in the 4th. And I was watching the game and I remember going, like, kind of talking to myself, it doesn't matter as a fan. We don't affect the game, but we can lie. I was like, this is it. They've got the lead. They're never giving it up again. The game is over. And at one point, Jimmy Butler takes a 3 and is guarded perfectly, I want to say, by Aaron Gordon. and Jimmy Butler just kicks him in the nuts.
Oh, I didn't see that.
Yeah, so
Oh,
that happens. And the refs call it as a foul. And this may be apocryphal, but I haven't heard that the ref that called the foul told the Nuggets to just challenge it. I think he was like, oh, my, the classic, fell for it, right? And we're watching the replay. I was looking at Twitter, of course, because the game stopped, and everybody's like, that's not a foul. Because if you jump and make contact with the player and then do the shot motion, you get a foul. That is not the same as jumping straight up, the player guarding you straight up, and then you kicking them. That no, you're not allowed to do that, right? Like if your upper body is going forward and you're making a shooting motion and you run into the player, that's one thing. If you jump up in the air and kick them, that is not on the defender.
and they changed
But
the rule even recently, Dre, to try to eliminate that even further. The anti-flopping rule, right?
yeah, like some of those things, yeah, you like to prevent landing and stuff, and like I can't remember the exact rules, but you're right. Like
You're not supposed to be able to kick people, is the point when you're shooting.
kick or land, right? Like exactly. But so everybody, this was one of those things where everybody was watching the game and it's like, okay, game, it's a contested game because I think the Nuggets were up. I think they were up by like 4 at that point, but Jimmy Butler gets 3 free throws. Scott Foster allegedly was the guy in the booth that reviewed the call, which makes a hell of a lot of sense. Okay, so Jimmy Butler gets 3 free throws, and then Jimmy Butler got like a rebound or a steal, and the Heat were up 1. And I was like, are you kidding me? And then, of course, the Nuggets just came back and won, and it was amazing. But Jimmy Butler, he put up a game-tying shot in the conference, not the conference finals. Or was it no, it wasn't the conference finals. The second round of the playoffs against the Toronto Raptors. He put up a game-tying layup, and then Kawhi Leonard had the first buzzer beater game 7 winner with a triple bounce. So there was that. And then in the game against the Celtics, he put up like a go ahead. I don't remember if it was the go ahead bucket or the game tying bucket. Had to have been the go ahead. He put up the go ahead bucket, and then Derek White, with 0.1 seconds on an inbound play, managed to score. And then same kind of thing with like 2 minutes to go in an NBA Finals game. Jimmy Butler gets his team up by 1 before losing it. So Jimmy Butler in his career has like 3, I would argue, maybe top 20 playoff plays of like stolen victory things. And I remember this happened. One of the most infamous for me is like the Spurs versus the Lakers. I think Tim Duncan put up like a 3 to tie the game or put the game ahead, and then Derek Fisher put up a last second 3. So like just those scenarios of must win situation, clutch play, you Michael Jordan it. This is what you've lived your entire life for, and then the other team snatches it away from you in 30 seconds.
Yeah, the 5-game choice, I think, was the right one. I think that was an easy call because the fact that the Nuggets were at home game 5, the one that you went to, I think made it the right choice. When you think a team is the better team, right? Much better, and you're not going to pick a 7-game series, you want to find that home game. That's the way to do the picks, I think.
And I mean, it was just a remark. Like for me, the timing of it was ridiculous because it had to be the Heat. Because if it wasn't the Heat, my brother was out of town. It had to be game 5. Like the only game that they could have won for the scenario that I saw to happen was that game 5, and it did. So it was a once in a lifetime, and not something I ever expected. We've done this podcast all year, and I really want to defend kind of a take I had going into this year and even into it, into like the playoffs and everything. Is I thought that Jamal Murray, Michael Porter Jr., Aaron Gordon, Nikola Jokic. I thought that core was a title team. And shout out to Howard Fear, fan of the show, who is a big Jimmy Butler proponent. He and I had some back and forth where he's just like, I don't know if that team's defensively strong enough to win a title. And I'm like, I don't care. That's an amazing core. And the only thing that stood in our way was injury. And when we went into the season, I was just like, you got Jamal Murray was over 500 games out of the league. Michael Porter Jr. has basically been injured every season of his career, I believe this season included. The idea that of a core, 40% of your star core, or in this case, I'm saying 50%, 50% of your star core has to be healthy, and they've never been healthy. And not only haven't they been, this is, we've talked about this a lot. Injuries compound in the NBA. So it's like, okay, you got this player that you're a huge fan of. Derrick Rose is our biggest example. We love this guy. He gets injured. You're like, okay, well, good news. Going to come back healthy. He's going to help the team. He gets injured again. Like, okay, he's going to come back healthy. He's going to help the team. Like the third injury, you're like, it's over. And I mean, even though Derrick Rose did see a resurgence, never close to the star level again. So, I just didn't think this team was ever going to be healthy enough. And they were. And not only and there is something about Jamal Murray in the NBA playoffs. So we talk as the very end of the regular season, we called it average averages, where Jamal Murray and Michael Porter Jr. had gotten their season average to average. But the good news is they started out bad coming back from injury. So that meant they were on an upward trajectory. They went into the NBA playoffs, and admittedly, Michael Porter Jr. disappeared for the finals, but Jamal Murray and Nikola Jokic were, spectacular 1 and 1A for most of the playoffs.
Yeah, and Bruce Brown has been such a big pickup. I think the biggest difference, number one, health, like you said, and then Aaron Gordon's improvement, and also getting Bruce Brown and Christian Brown to some extent as well. He didn't quite play as big a role or as many minutes, but both of those Brown brothers, they were pretty damn good. Yeah, KCP as well. Again, not quite as big a role as some of these other guys, but all the other, top 6 or 7 Nuggets, who are the players that end up mattering in the finals, right? Those guys are all selling.
Oh, and Brian, I forgot this, and you got to see it. So this feels made up. Admittedly, it wasn't a good game for him, but I'll take it. So in the playoffs, another weird, annoying thing that happened is Nikola Jokic got into foul trouble early. And they put in Jeff Green. And I was like, I hate this. Because you replace Nikola Jokic with Jeff Green. And Jeff Green looked terrible quick. They learned their freaking lesson. They're like, we're not putting Jeff Green out there with Bama Adebayo. And they put in DeAndre Jordan. And DeAndre Jordan recorded a block in the NBA Finals. Now, here's the thing. DeAndre Jordan is one of these guys that for years I have said was like MVP caliber. When he was on the Clippers, like him and Chris Paul were, again, a 1 and 1A. Underrated, underappreciated. But at this point, I think he's old. And I mean, we kind of know this about big players, is they just get injured and beat up, and they get into their 30s. And even if they're productive, you just run out of what you can expect out of them. But I got DeAndre Jordan recording a block in the game-winning NBA Finals game. And I mean, you also can't hate that, right? That DeAndre Jordan wins a ship before Chris Paul. That's
yeah, it was good to see him get one. He's had a lot of good years. He's got some other issues in age. Some centers, if they've gotten older, have developed 3-point shots like Brook Lopez to stay relevant. He just never did. He's kind of an old school style player. But yeah, I mean, he put in some good minutes there. You can't argue with what actually happened in real life. He was good.
Yeah, it's like kind of they're two comparables, by the way, to the Golden State Warriors. DeAndre Jordan, coming on the tail of on the bench to win a title, reminds me a lot of JaVale McGee getting his with the Warriors. And interestingly enough, you brought up Aaron Gordon. Aaron Gordon this year reminds me a ton of Draymond Green on 2016. Now, admittedly, they didn't win. They should have, is what it is. But Draymond Green just went out of his mind that season and was the best power forward in the NBA. We really like him, but I mean, one thing we've argued is that he is, undersized to play power forward center, and that's beating him up, and he's getting older. Aaron Gordon basically did that with the proper outcome, right? Like Aaron Gordon goes on to be great in the regular season. I think he has one game-winning finals game.
He's a lot bigger than Draymond Green as well, but point taken, he's still relatively small.
But yeah, very, very similar to the Warriors, what should have been their greatest season win. Aaron Gordon did the same thing. Aaron Gordon just put up, an amazing season. I don't know. I mean, this team could go all the way back. My 2 cents is it's just winning an NBA title is really hard. The harsh reality is this team did not look like a standard NBA title team. However, what we noticed is this playoffs was bizarre. So many teams, Nuggets included, were not the same team in the regular season as they were in the playoffs. Because if you look at most of these teams, you're like, their SRS is terrible. How are they going to win? The Nuggets top 6, you were talking top 7, even Brown brothers, right? KCP, we knew what we were getting, but like Jamal Murray turns into a star in the playoffs. Aaron Gordon stays great. Michael Porter Jr. stays healthy. Nikola Jokic almost averages a triple-double over the NBA playoffs, which is even better than what should have been his 3rd consecutive MVP. Brian, I am never going to let that go. So keep that in mind. If we podcast for another decade, Brian, you're going to get to hear a lot about that. Apologies in advance. But, you know, we just haven't seen that. It's possible if the Nuggets are healthy next season. And shout out to Coach Malone, who did something really good, really savvy in the playoff championship. That's the word I was looking for. Parade. He's like drunk. He's amazing. I love him. He's just like down on drinks. And when it's his turn to speak, he's talking about Bruce Brown. And he's like, Bruce Brown's not going anywhere. Because I think Bruce Brown is either an unrestricted or restricted free agent. And I, putting it on the spot. But it's just like, if this team is back and healthy, I have no problem viewing them as a contender next season. But I also know the fragility and how hard it is to maintain a contender, and how the Kroenke organization traditionally has not been really great at being willing to pony up for wins, which is why like Aaron Gordon back in the day was such a shocker. So I'm just going to enjoy it. And like, I'm also going to enjoy that. Like, I can never go to another NBA playoff game that matches that, right? First time in 40 years, the Nuggets made a finals, first title ever. Like, I'm good. I'm good with live games. Got it off my bucket list.
Yeah. I mean, there could be more in the future. It'll be tough to keep Bruce Brown. We'll have to see what the market is going to look like. We're going to talk about this John Collins trade a little bit later, but even though there seems to be NBA insiders saying there's going to be an active trade market this offseason, at the same time, we've got this new CBA, we've got the new luxury tax that's more punitive, might be tougher for teams to hold on to players like Bruce Brown. So
that is a funny note, because the good news is I think I saw that like the salary cap was 5-10 million more than they were expected. It's like 130 million. And the annoying reality of that is that means it's easier to acquire players. You're going to have more money to spend. But you're right. They increase the punitive damages for being over the cap. And this is multi-year. So with that in mind, it's going to be hard. Like, that's what's funny. It's going to be easier to construct a winning team if you're 1 or 2 pieces away. It's going to be harder if you are, say, the Nuggets or even the Warriors to stay together. I do have a question. Sorry to take a brief off-road.
Sure.
Obviously, Draymond Green is a free agent. And I was a little surprised by this, because someone said, like, how much would you pay for Draymond? And they said, like, 3 years, 80. And at first I was like, are you kidding? He was still productive this season. And one advantage, if you give like a 3-year, 80 million, is like, that doesn't mean he's untradeable in year 2 or year 3. So I've got to buy that Draymond comes back to the Warriors, because I don't see them letting him out the door and getting back commensurate value, especially since, as you noted, despite the fact we'll talk the CP3 trade in a sec, despite the fact that that is really good for them, they are really into the cap, and they are really thin at the big man. And it's going to be really, really hard for them to like get more players with where they're at cap wise.
Yeah, that's right. And we're going to talk about the Chris Paul trade, of course, a little bit later. But as great as it is to move off of Jordan Poole's salary, which is going to get kind of ridiculous in the next few years for the Warriors, that salary was what they need to use for a big man, right? And they just don't have those players anymore. The reporting has been that both Draymond and the Warriors are trying to get this deal done. So right now everyone thinks it's going to happen. But at the same time, it's difficult for me to see how the Warriors are going to pay Draymond what he wants when they are trying to stay out of that second apron that is super punitive. And other teams like the Kings and others seem to be interested in Draymond. Of course, rumors are always funny. Like, where are they coming from? Are those rumors coming from Draymond's agent that he wants to go to the Kings, or from the Kings himself, right? So who knows?
My Kings thing wasn't made up, because I was thinking that would just be funny to have him and Sabonis on a team next to each other.
Well, that's why everyone thinks it's so funny that that's a rumor. But
yeah,
I thought he will go back to the Warriors. I think he will go back to the Warriors. It probably will look something like that. 3 years, 80 million. I of course would love to pay him either, less years and a smaller, amount, or a big amount for 1 year maybe. But the Warriors don't have any options, so I think they are gonna probably pay him a lot of money to stay.
But
And
see,
also,
that's the
he's
thing.
Steph's guy. That's the other thing. He's Steph's guy, and they need to keep Steph happy after his other guy Bob Myers has left the team.
I really want to stress this, and this might be the next article. I'm going to try and be more regular. Substack.nerdnumbers.com, where I did get a fun article out on the Chris Paul trade that was immediately validated, although it had to invalidate, unfortunately, another point but we'll get to that in a second. But what I was really curious about is, right, if you talk 3 years, 30 million, wow, the Indiana Pacers aren't paying anybody anything for what it's worth. I just looked at their salary cap. Miles Turner is their most expensive guy.
And this is why, just briefly, they're rumored to be in all these trades, because there's only a few teams that have all this cap space that can take on contracts, right? Similar to the John Collins trade.
But what I was going to say is, if you look up like Pascal Siakam, he is 37 million this season, which is 27%. So the goodish news is we go down to 30, because that's what we were saying. And I just said the alternative, right? The cap's going up to like 120. That's not bad, right? That's not horrible to be around 30 million, to be, in that position. You are not as horrible, right? You're closer to 20. Like that would be an average starter that you're looking for in the NBA. He's overpaid by a little, but not a ton. And that's what makes it really, really hard to kind of gauge good and bad contracts, right? We were noting that, mid-level exception is like over 10 million. I might end up being right on Russell Westbrook getting over 25 just because of how stuff's gone up. Although if he gets over 25, someone made a mistake. Hate to say it now. So I don't think it's a mistake to do that with Draymond, and I think it's fine provided everything can work out. I am just really curious if they can find a big man. Although one funny one, and I'm really curious about his contract. Let's get into the meat and potatoes, the main one. So the Chris Paul trades. Now, the first one was really simple and straightforward, right? Like I said, I wrote about it at Substack. Was namely Chris Paul and Bradley Beal basically getting shopped for each other. And I would argue that the Wizards got kind of a landmine, and that they got Landry Shamet. I hope I'm saying that right as well.
Landry Shamet, yeah.
Landry
very
Shamet.
close, very close.
Thank you. Landry, okay.
Yeah.
They got him back in the trade, and it really was to make the trade work, right? Because Chris Paul is 30 million a season. He got boosted 8 million trade exemption. So good on him. He made 8 million just for getting traded. And Shamet was just like that extra 10 was required to make the pick work. And that's what I said, is it's wild. The modern landscape of the NBA, 10 million is the player to be thrown in to make the trade work. Whereas there was a time in NBA history where 10 million was too rich to re-sign Steve Nash. So that's where we're at now. The world's a crazy place. Basically just Chris Paul for Bradley Beal. And this trade was an obvious loss, just zero questions out of the Suns. The real reason being, like, here's my logic, and I put it in the article. Bradley Beal is an older, worse Devin Booker. Like, really, it's rough, and I say this in the article, and I feel bad because both Bradley Beal and Devin Booker put up some games, right? Devin Booker is one of the top 20 all-time individual game scorers, and if you take out the Wilt Chamberlain era, like top 5, because he's got a 70-pointer, Devin Booker's put up some games. Devin Booker can score. We even agree with that. Like, he's like 60% true shooting, but that's like all he does. He's like below average and middling at everything else. Like, he is, I think, an average passing shooting guard, and that's not good because you don't really want, like, he passes a lot and then he gets a lot of turnovers, and he doesn't do it at a great rate. So really, Devin Booker does not do that much great. And Bradley Beal is very similar. And I note this, that Bradley Beal in 2019 was a cubic zirconium star. I think I'm going to label it that, because you and I have had this discussion. We use the wins per 48 metric around here. Dave Barry's metric of choice, the wins produced formula that calculates how many wins a player earns you. And this is like total, right? So when I say Bradley Beal earns you 10 wins, that's just like it doesn't tell you above average. Like wins above average, I kind of like. Wins per 48 is what you really go towards that, because 100 is average, 200 is star, 300 is like upper echelon, and 400 is like, what are we witnessing this season? And we've seen, some great players like Michael Jordan, Magic Johnson, Nikola Jokic hit those kind of levels. So Bradley Beal managed to hit 10 wins produced, which I've called a star level, but he basically did it by getting 3,000 minutes, which doesn't happen anymore, at a good, not great level, 166 win per 48. So 66% better than an average player. And if you even compare that to, say, Chris Paul last season, Chris Paul was 2.5 times good as an average player. So Bradley Beal, cubic zirconium star. He puts up those 10 wins that I demand, but he does it the same way that he's good at scoring. He takes lots of shots. And that is a problem, because the way that both Bradley Beal and Devin Booker look above average, according to the numbers we look at, is by shooting above average. We agree with that, but by taking lots of shots. And here's a very simple problem that people bring up all the time about sharing the ball. If you put them on a team together, they both can't get all those shots. The reason players like LeBron James and Dwayne Wade will work next to each other, Michael Jordan, Scottie Pippen, is they do everything. So if Michael Jordan isn't shooting the ball, Scottie Pippen can shoot the ball. And if Scottie Pippen isn't shooting, he's passing and he's rebounding and he's defending. And I am sorry, Devin Booker and Bradley Beal, at least in their box score stats, don't really do these things. So really, one or both of them, it's either going to be Bradley Beal or Devin Booker looks productive next season and the other one takes a hit, or they both take a hit. It is not possible, unless they find a way to get 10 to 20 more possessions a game, which would require like a really talented defensive point guard like Chris Paul, or a really talented big. And I think DeAndre Ayton's out the door. Ayton needs, I agree with you, by the way, Brian, let's go into existence. DeAndre Ayton just needs to go to the Warriors. Let's just make that happen.
Rumor is today he is not being traded. He's going to stay in Phoenix, but we'll see. That's been back and forth so many times.
This is Jimmy Butler in Minnesota 2.0, whatever you want to call it. I mean, I could be wrong, but this is just one of those cases where everybody's unhappy with each other. Now, we might get a Rudy Gobert situation where they manage to keep him for an extra year, but sorry if I'm being too Bayesian, but if you look at NBA history, when like a max level player and a front office just do not like each other,
that's right,
they get traded. And I can't think of, now I'm happy to be proven wrong. So if you're in the chat,
there is a new ownership group and front office on the Suns, and coach for that matter. They got rid of Monty Williams. Is that enough to mend the rift, though? I tend to agree with you. I think it's yeah.
The new coach might be interesting. That could be something. But and that was bizarre too. Like firing the Phoenix Suns coach. I would especially argue after how the playoffs shook out, because the Phoenix Suns were the only team that made the Nuggets look human. They're the only team that made us bleed. And what people may forget already is Nikola Jokic put up a 50-point game that in most playoff games is just a win. Like I thought it was going to be the Nuggets win at home, the Suns win at home, the Nuggets win at home, which is what happened. But the Nuggets had a game where Nikola Jokic tried to steal the game in Phoenix, and Phoenix held on. And that was where I got scared. I was like, wait a minute, if Nikola Jokic is going full burn and we lose, is it possible that the Suns are going to be able to steal one at home from us? And luckily they did not. But the Suns really were the best Western Conference team. Like the Nuggets, 16-4, Brian, what an amazing freaking postseason record. Not like your Warriors 16-1, but I'll take 16-4, which by the way, because of some cute math, puts them at the best all-time playoff record for a finals team, for a team that's like, this makes any sense. If you look at the win-loss record in final seasons of teams that have won an NBA Finals, the Denver Nuggets are now number 1. And that's because teams like the Warriors had seasons that they had more losses and stuff like that. So that's just amusing. I thought the Suns could have just tried running it back. And I think it was kind of a ridiculous expectation, because I think if they had traded for Kevin Durant earlier, they would have been a better seed and maybe looked better in the playoffs. So it is really wild to me how at the end of the season they viewed it as a failure and not a success, which is to say you were away against the hottest home court team in the NBA right now. You still managed to make them look human. And yeah, you lost, but you were supposed to lose. What happens if you get the number 2 or number 3 seed next season and Denver isn't the number 1 seed, which is very much a possibility. But now we'll never get to see it because Chris Paul is gone. I definitely think that the Phoenix Suns, like I said, are in trouble, just because they've got Devin Booker and Bradley Beal who are redundant. Devin Booker is older. That's the other fear, right? Is he's entering his 30s. He's the weakest position, and if you watch him, he has been declining in minutes over the last 3 seasons, declining in production from his peak. It's like,
wait, do you mean Beal? Booker's not
Beal,
that
sorry,
is he?
Beal.
Okay.
Booker, I think, is fine. Booker's entering his prime and maybe even might have a next level, but he's going to be hurt by
Beal
the fact.
is in his 30s. Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah. So Beal, sorry. Yeah, and as you can see, I'm confusing Beal and Booker because they're the same players separated by 5 years.
They start with B. They start with the letter B.
They both start with B.
Just
they're
like
both
Brian.
on the Sun.
No,
You're just
Chris Paul never gets enough credit, I think. It's easy to... I think he's like James Harden, his former teammate, in that people just don't like his style of play. It's aesthetically unpleasing to them. They don't like his behavior on the court as well, yelling at the refs, and they just think he's old and busted. The fact that he's still incredibly efficient and still putting up all the numbers, it's easy to overlook that when you're not nose deep in it like we are. Devin Booker is interesting because he was not... so you use the word cubic zirconia star. I used to say fake star. That word kind of got appropriated in 2016, so I don't know if I want to use fake anymore. But he is a legitimate star now, and he has been. But what is the reason for it? Is it because of the age curve, and he's improved, and he's just legitimately better now? Or was it because he could play shooting guard and Chris Paul could handle the ball? Because before Chris Paul was on the Suns, they did have Devin Booker playing more point guard and handling the ball more, and he wasn't great at it. So here we have a great scientific test, right? Is he improved legitimately, or was it more Chris Paul? It'll be interesting.
Well, I mean, I've always had problems. The king of this would be like Allen Iverson. I've always had problems with a productive player on a good team getting too much credit. The wildest one to say this about might be 1998 Michael Jordan. Other years, all the other titles, it's not him, but in 1998, Michael Jordan was a decent, not great player next to some great teammates who basically, I don't want to say when you're an above average player, I don't like the word carried, but basically Michael Jordan wasn't the first or even second banana on that team and gets all the credit for it because he scores the points. And I think Devin Booker is very much like that, right? I think like Chris Paul, DeAndre Ayton can definitely, when they had Miles Turner, am I getting the right Miles? Too many Miles.
I don't know if they had him. I'm not sure.
No, who's the Miles they traded to Brooklyn?
Ooh, I don't know. Let's see. It was Mikal Bridges, Cam Johnson.
Bridges, not Miles. Mikal, sorry. Mikal Bridges,
yeah.
right, was another good player that like just his 3-point shooting was off the charts. And we were like, he's amazing. So, I mean, basically Devin Booker being the guy that we think is a cog in a good team, but not the number 1 or number 2 player, that makes it really, really rough. And I don't necessarily think it's like a fake star, but it is just like, if those are the players you invest in and you slowly start shedding the real productive players on your team, you're going to end up in trouble. And that's already what happens with the Suns. And the good news is I'm not worried about the Suns next season, especially because I 100% see them imploding, right? They are definitely.
Too. Well, Kevin Durant's health, right? Kevin Durant was able to play hurt last year, and it still cost them in the playoffs. I mean, I think that's the real. So you said a few minutes ago that the Suns might have been the best team at one point last season, and I tend to agree with that. But then they got a bunch of injuries, and of course the Nuggets were definitely the best team in the playoffs. So yeah, I mean, will Durant be healthy? They also just don't have any players on their roster right now. That's true for some teams, but I think they have like 6 players under contract. They might have gotten a 7th today, who's like a $1 million player. But yeah, I don't think they have any point guards at all. So they're in the same kind of situation as the Warriors, but worse, where they need to find a bunch of veteran free agents. And last point is their problem is not offense, it's defense. And I mean,
Oh yeah.
Beal is not the guy that's going to improve their defense.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's like, and even if you go for this, because we've talked like the Brian bins of productivity. Hey, it's been a while, Brian. They're back because we're in the off
They're
season.
back.
That's the Brian bins of productivity. Basically,
It's like a
very
trip to
similar.
Costco every day. We're getting bulk goods.
Yeah, well, that's the thing. In the off season, you go to Costco, you stock up on the Brian bins of productivity because you need those to get through the long, harsh regular season. This analogy lands is even if you like look at the Warriors or Suns. How about the Suns, Brian? You look at the Suns offense and you're like, how can we improve this? You don't give mid-range shooting guard minutes because that's the other thing. Neither Beal or Booker is that great from three, so you're not really increasing floor spacing. Like I said, they're the same player, so it's going. Yeah, the ways you would improve this offense are like a player like Chris Paul who passes a lot
Yeah.
and takes threes, or another, maybe another like a more defensive minded big to go next to DeAndre Ayton, like a Rudy Gobert would be really great. So it's just like, yeah, you look at what the team needs and they didn't go for it. Let's talk about the other part, me being right and wrong immediately. So, same article I was talking at the very end, I basically get to the end and I'm like, Phoenix resoundingly loses this trade. And Washington wins just by getting rid of Beal because Beal is 4 years, $224 million. And it's like, like I said, all of the stats you're looking at, you're like, oh my God, this is the Titanic. He's not getting better. He's going to get worse, and he's going to cost us 55 million like his last season. We have got to get out of this contract before it's impossible, because even one more bad season out of Beal and you're not trading $160 million contract. So they did it. Good job. Washington wins, but they pick up Chris Paul, and I'm like, I don't believe you. I was like, that was a really good move. That was a really good, really savvy move. I do not believe this is going to work out for you. And lo and behold, they turn around and trade Chris Paul immediately to the Golden State Warriors for Jordan Poole. So all of the good stuff I got to say about the Washington Wizards, about getting rid of an overrated cubic zirconium star for a productive player. And Chris Paul, by the way, the one news I'll say is like, he's just pure upside. He's 2 years, 30 million, which very similar to Draymond Green, might be a little overpaid.
Second year team option, by the way, too. So they can get off of him after 1 year if the Warriors want to.
Oh, I missed that. Let me verify that. I mean, no, this is ridiculous. It means Chris Paul might be slightly overpaid this season, with a weird caveat. We didn't bring up all this discussion. We were talking like, say, Draymond Green's contract, where something that's funny is like, let's say a player costs you 23% of the salary cap. And so you say, okay, well, I'd want 23% of the average wins. So, you'd really want that player to be worth, 8 wins to be worth that contract. And I say, oh, they're probably worth 6. And you go, I don't know, I'm losing a couple million. But then I say, hey, but guess what? They're going to be worth 1 or 2 wins in the playoffs. And playoff wins are like, the data I have gone off of for years, which is horrendously outdated, is when the Brooklyn Nets, at the time New Jersey Nets, they had some leaked financials, and they basically said a home playoff game was worth $1 to $2 million in gate revenue. And that was in the early 2000s. That's when Steve Nash leaving for, I think, $12 million a season was a big deal. And now, like, $12 million for an MVP caliber player would be a steal. So with that in mind, a playoff one's got to be worth like 4 or 5 million now, right? With just how things have gone up. So if Chris Paul is worth 20 million in the regular season, but he wins you 2 to 3 games in the playoffs. Now, rough part, I brought this up in the article. He had a bad playoffs last season, Brian. So do we think he's able to come back? Who knows? We'll see. But yeah, so I mean, like, he could easily be worth that 30 million next season. And then if he is just gassed, they're out. So that would have been beautiful for the Wizards. That would have been a perfect trade for the Wizards, except they turn around for Jordan Poole. And how I'm right and wrong is, in my article, I'm like, I'm sorry, I don't believe the Wizards are going to pull this off. I don't trust them. It's one of those. I was like, the Wizards the Wizards just did something really good. No, I don't believe it. And then I was right. And I was like, yes. And then the other part about this that's just hilarious is, on our last show, I think I've already mentioned this, when we were talking about the new Warriors front office, and Brian, it could just be small sample size. You got to be feeling jazzed about the Dunleavy era, right?
Yeah,
So far,
it's interesting. And I do have an update that I looked up when you were talking, is that there is a Yahoo Sports article from 2023 that mentions regular season gate revenue, that the Warriors get over 4 million per game at Chase Center and the Lakers and Knicks get over 3 million per game at their arenas. So, I don't know if that includes like third part, aftermarket, so maybe playoffs are worth even more than that. But your number of 5 million or whatever you said seems to be in the right ballpark.
that is, yeah, that's ridiculous. And but yeah, the other part is, so the Dunleavy era. We talked the Dunleavy
Yeah.
era of the Warriors, and I was like, hey, maybe Brian's right, because you were optimistic. You basically not you were not dissing Bob Myers, but what you basically said is, unlike other front offices, the Warriors have more like egalitarian. They like have
Yeah.
multiple people in the front office make decisions together. So the only real way the Warriors are going to lose is if they lose out on the allure of attracting stars to the Warriors, which I do think Bob Myers was a part of, but you've argued that might be a lot of Steph Curry, which, it's hard to say. So you were saying that, and I was like, well, Brian's right to be optimistic, but flip side, you're stuck with Jordan Poole. He's not going anywhere. And even if you get rid of him, it's going, he's really expensive and you're not getting anything good back for him. Immediately wrong. But you know what, Brian? I would rather be what the exact two outcomes I said. The poker metaphor I had is, I was like, immediately cashed out, like automatically won the hand, I have the nuts, versus immediately drawing dead. I am not mad to be immediately within a week validated by my takes on a poorly run NBA front office, and to be drawing dead on kind of a lukewarm take on, we've had some complaints with, say, I basically Joe Lacob is my 2 cents, but the Warriors have been a good run franchise. Whatever they're doing, right? They have a decade of success. They've made some mistakes, but there is not a team in the NBA that hasn't. They have been a well-run team, and it looks like they're going to continue to be well-run. The only thing, Brian, that's going to be terrifying is, can they get out of Klay Thompson? I do not have faith in that team as long as Klay Thompson is on the roster.
Yeah, then so that is what is also going on while the Draymond Green deal is being renegotiated. So I'm saying that wrong, of course. Draymond's a free agent. Klay has one more year for roughly 40 million, which is ridiculous, of course. So are they going to let him ride out for 1 year on that amount of salary? Are they going to renegotiate his deal and extend him, or are they going to try to trade him? Those are basically the options. I think they will try to extend him, which of course we think is a mistake. But yeah, they're going to deal with Draymond first because he's a lot more important, and also because he's not under contract, right? There's a time sensitive part of Draymond. But to your question, I am overall optimistic about the Dunleavy era so far. The big question was going to be, once he's in there, are they going to continue the direction they were in last year or change direction? And some of the fear was, well, maybe if he's this existing guy, he's going to be weak. He's just going to do what the Lacob family says, and we're going to continue doing this, 2 timelines, young players kind of roster thing. They've already given up on that, and you can tell by their actions. So there's been kind of small moves they've made that have all been good and signaled that they know what they're doing these days and are trying to do the right thing. And then, of course, the one big move that is very material, getting rid of Jordan Poole, that was very positive. That deal is it's very long. It happened last year. But he was still on his rookie deal last year, right? So this is the first year it kicks in, and it's going, I think, for 3 more years. So they had to get off of that. They figured out last year that he was not going to be the guy. And honestly, it never made sense. He played well for them in the finals run that they won last year, but that was kind of the only time he was really stepping up. He was inconsistent other times. And also, he wants to be a starter and have the ball in his hands and take a million shots. People are joking, oh, he's going to lead the league in points per game on the Wizards. That, to me, it seemed like it was always what he wanted, was to try to lead the league in points per game. So how is he ever going to be on the bench behind Stephen Curry? That never made any sense when they have such a similar role. So, yeah, the the deal didn't make sense. I was optimistic about it to some extent because, they were coming off of that finals run where he played well, but it never happened. So they were smart to get off of it. But here's my really hot take is that this does kind of remind me of Devin Booker or Donovan Mitchell, player that has a ton of skills, that scores a lot of points per game, that everyone in the league likes, and we don't because they're not efficient and they're too young. And, in 2 years, if he's 25, 26, maybe he actually will get there and be that kind of player. But the Warriors don't have that kind of time. Like you said, they need Chris Paul right now. They can't, hand the keys to Jordan Poole after Steph turns 40 or whatever. It's not going to happen. So it was a good move. The draft picks were good too. The first guy they got at number 19 was the guy out of Santa Clara, Podziemski. Was one of the best shooters in college. He shot like 43% from three, and also he led the West Coast Conference in rebounding as a point guard, which is kind of amazing. So he's a stats darling. The other guy they got, I think at like the end of the second round, 56th pick or whatever, 57th, Trayce Jackson. Sorry, I'm forgetting his second hyphenated name right now. So maybe my argument's not persuasive. I can't remember his name, but he was an All-American first team. He was one of the top 5 players in college and kind of plays like a bigger Draymond Green, just a defensive specialist that can't shoot that well. So they got really good draft picks.
Did they trade for him? I'm looking.
They did. They got us. They traded Patrick Baldwin Jr. for a second round pick at the very end of the draft. Yeah. Oh, that I think is one of those trades that hasn't happened yet, Dre. It has to wait till July.
Oh yeah, these get so for what it's worth, I'll give a shout out to friend of the show, Ty Willinghans, who we still need to have on at some point.
He probably loves Podziemski because he's from Wisconsin.
Oh, and we'll have to give another shout out to him as well. I'm hoping this turns into a thing. He actually contacted Popcorn Machine. He has been much more invested in defense than I am, but I don't have a complaint with how he does it. And what he has started doing is he has gone with Popcorn Machine and really wants to look at opposing player stats while a player is on the court and get that kind of information.
So you're saying individual defensive adjustments like Greek God stats kind of thing?
Well, what I would say more is, so the wins produced, what we do is, and we could do similar to what he's doing, but he's going even more exact. What we do is we go, hey, let's look at how well the team for non-explicit, because a lot of the defense is captured in the box scores, defensive rebounds, steals, fouls, those are captured. But basically, if we look at opposing turnovers that aren't attributed to a player by a steal, or opposing misses, basically shot percentage, how valuable is that? And we just put it all in a bucket and divide it up by minutes played. And what you could go one step further is if you actually want to start assigning blame. Now, I still don't 100% agree, because the Warriors are a good example. Switching is a thing.
Yeah.
Defense is a team activity, but I still don't mind making it a little more granular. So he's excited about that. And I was like, hey, we got to talk this more. And he said at some point in the future. But Ty Willinghans is a Milwaukee Bucks fan, and for years has pointed out that the way the NBA works is not the same as other leagues, where what you're saying, right? Like draft day trades, it is not, if on the day of the draft, you and I, let's say I'm the Bucks and you're the Warriors, if we want to trade on draft day, what I can do is I can say, hey, I want to trade picks, you agree, but what happens is you have to go up to the podium, you draft the player, but you accept that you pick whoever I'm going to pick and you're going to send him over. Those are the rules. But it is not, if we look at the box score, right? The pick is not attributed to me. It is attributed to you, even though it's my pick. So that kind of stuff is funny. And
you get the guy wearing the wrong hat on camera. That's always fun.
Exactly. And the reason he brings this up is a notorious thing in Milwaukee Bucks history is that we traded, Robert Tractor.
That's right. For Dirk. Robert Tractor Trailer. Robert Tractor Trailer. Rip in peace.
Much better. Much better nickname. Now he's like, hey, we did not pass on. He's like, we did not draft Dirk and then trade him. Now, an example of that happening, by the way, would be Kawhi. So the Indiana Pacers drafted Kawhi, and the Spurs called them up and said, hey, would you be willing to trade Kawhi for George Hill?
I think the Warriors did this with Anton Jameson and Vince Carter. Like they almost got Vince Carter, but couldn't.
Oh, that would have been cool. But I'm
Yeah.
saying that there's a subtle distinction between the Spurs calling up Indiana, doing a draft day trade, and then picking Kawhi, and the Spurs calling up and saying, "Hey, you picked Kawhi, can we get him?" Because the second one tells you, "Hey, absolutely don't trade them. You've made a mistake." Now, the easy defense is Trailer was picked before Dirk,
Yeah.
so the Bucks passed on Dirk to pick Trailer. So you're like, hey, they didn't pick Dirk. It's like they didn't pick Dirk and trade him. They just missed him entirely. And I'm like, I'm not sure that's a persuasive argument, but all right. But that's basically what you're saying happened here with the Warriors is that when I'm looking at the stat sheet, when I'm trying to track you, I can't see it attributed to them. But Trayce Jackson Davis is, I think,
Jackson
you're talking
Davis.
about.
Yep. Yeah. So he
And
was drafted by the Wizards, and he will be traded to the Warriors for Patrick Baldwin Jr.
I mean, to what you say, he kind of looks like he was a 2010 player in college, really good from the field.
He was one
Needs
of the
to learn how to
best
shoot.
win share players in college. Like he was a
Yeah,
defensive specialist.
needs to learn how to shoot free throws, but kind of what they need. But the basic point I've made. I want to finish talking the trades and we can talk a little draft.
Oh, can I say one more thing on Dunleavy before we keep going that I like?
Sure.
The small things. He got asked on draft day, Podziemski, your first round pick, is he gonna? You'd expect him to play next year. Is he gonna be in the rotation? Dunleavy's like, no, you should never expect a rookie to play the rookie year. I'm like, thank you, Mike Dunleavy, a realistic GM. Anyway,
I don't know what to do. I'm a fan. That's the thing too, is I kind of noted to you, like the Nuggets got their title. After they got their title and you traded for Chris Paul, I was like, hey, Brian, I got my win. I'm satisfied for another 40 years. Warriors can go back to light years. I'm okay with Warriors being light years again. Nuggets got their title.
I haven't really talked about Chris Paul yet, but we'll do that probably another show.
No, I mean, I think that the simple reality is Chris Paul, we talked his contract. Basically, the thing is he's old. He's kind of, I would say, like Jason Kidd on the Kings, Jason Kidd on the Knicks, right? He is still productive. He is not what he was at his peak. Still very good. His contract is not bad. And he is going to, I think, I was excited. Like you and I actually had not even an argument. I was like, man, I want to see Chris Paul next to Steph Curry. I just want to see it.
Just for the historical aspect of it, it's really cool, I think.
Yeah. So, I mean, we're definitely down with it.
Because, Dre, these are probably the two best point guards since Magic, right? Like, or if not, it's a debate. Like, that's how good they are. They're two of the best of their generation, and they're on the same team. It's remarkable.
The stat I have used is one thing the wins produce formula does, which all of the stats need to do, and I might at one point write an article about this. I was going to call it like advanced stats or remedial. That was my cutesy title. Is you have to adjust for two things: position and the league you are in. So, I mean, that's a modern day issue I see a lot. There's a guy named Andrew Bailey who quotes Basketball Reference incessantly on Twitter. I don't know why I'm throwing stones because I quote Basketball Reference incessantly on Twitter, but he'll do stuff like he'll be like, Joel Embiid is the first player since Shaquille O'Neal to average, 20, 10, and blah in these situations. And I'm like, yeah, here's the thing. If Joel Embiid was doing that in 2002, that would be the best player in the league. But Joel Embiid doing that in 2023, he is not good. And that's actually a hard part. Like if the Shaquille O'Neal from 2002, man, that's how far away it is, Brian. That's ridiculous. So I'm like 20 and I'm like, oh, wait, we didn't have to say the decade after in the 2000s. So if Shaquille O'Neal in his unanimous or not unanimous, his best 2000 where he won MVP, Finals MVP, All-Star MVP, if that production came to the modern NBA, it would be bad. Or it would be average, right? It would be decent because the league changes. So you have to adjust for position and you have to adjust for the league that you are in. And so that just really makes things hard when we're trying to like average across and look at players. And what makes Steph Curry and Chris Paul amazing in that regard is if you treated them as centers in their best seasons, they would look like the best center in the league, which is like both Chris Paul, because that's the thing is that there are numbers you look at, you're like, is this player good? And the annoying reality I can give you is I'm like, tell me that if you don't tell me the position, I don't know, because that's really good for a shooting guard and really bad for a center, or that's, average for a small forward, but, below average for a point guard. Kind of the same thing we were talking about with Devin Booker. Like, Devin Booker's an okay passer for a shooting guard, but if you wanted to be a point guard now, those numbers are bad for a point guard. So what are we going to get? Chris Paul, Steph Curry have been so productive that you would be fine trotting them out of center. And that's been one of our arguments against players like Andrea Bargnani or even Kristaps Porzingis. Nice subtle segue, Brian.
The Warriors might start Chris Paul or Steph Curry at center. They don't have any big men, Dre.
They might have to. But I was just going to say, like, you look at players like Kristaps Porzingis or Andrea Bargnani, and you're like, well, if they were a shooting guard, they might be all right, but they are getting played as a center, and that is bad. Whereas Chris Paul and Steph Curry in their heyday, you could play him as a center and be like, yeah, I'm still getting the production I need. Let's talk that trade. So this one was, I kind of mentioned the same point on me not trusting the Wizards, because Boston makes a superstar trade, Brian. And you and our eyes were bright last show. We were like, what about Damian Lillard? Can they turn Jaylen Brown into something? And they got Kristaps Porzingis. Now, I noted the rough part is Kristaps Porzingis is a player where his production in 2002 would look good. 2023, it does not. He is an above average shooter for a center, but he is not in the same upper echelon of players like Joel Embiid and Nikola Jokic, and he does not do all the other stuff that needs to happen. Additionally, he's old. He is constantly injury prone. I am scared because last season was like his best year in a while, and I question if he can hold on to that. And the goodish news is I don't think the Celtics gave up too much. Like, Danilo Gallinari is just not going to be healthy. And Mike Muscala, we mentioned when he was
Celtics fans are mad that you said that right now, Dre. They love Marcus Smart. They love him.
Marcus Smart is an above average shooting guard, point guard, but he's older. Like, it's not great. I'm not happy that a above average, like if the Nuggets gave up not Chris Porzingis, gave up KCP for a below average center, I would be upset. So this is not a good trade for the Celtics in any sense of the word. They now have a really expensive player in a really important position, because another thing to consider about this position is, Al Horford's getting older. So like the Celtics backcourt and middle court was fine. They really needed big men, and they just got a below average one. So I really hate this trade for the Celtics. And what gets remarkable to me is we were talking this, I think at the start of the show or before the show, where no one knows what the hell they're doing. At one point, the Celtics were going to ship out Malcolm Brogdon. I was like, I absolutely hate this trade as a result. And what ends up happening is they ship out Marcus Smart because they needed to find another team, which was the Memphis Grizzlies. And the Washington Wizards at one point were going to get Marcus Morris and draft picks, and instead ended up with Tyus Jones, who is a really productive player. So this trade is hilarious to me in that Boston got worse. Boston, the number 2 seed out west, got worse. I think was Memphis number 3 last year. The number 3 seed out.
I can't remember.
Yeah.
It's weird because Ja Morant got hurt, right? So they kind of weren't the same team, but
it was Steve Adams, Brandon Clark, Ja Morant, all got injured.
And Adams and Clark, of course. Yeah.
So 100% agreed with you there. But basically, the number 3 seed out west just got worse. The number 2 seed out east just got worse, and Washington just got better. But I still don't like. They were like a 35-win team, and Bradley Beal, despite being overrated, was still above average. I don't know if they've got themselves into playoff shape. So I'm like a fan of this move. If you're rooting for like the 76ers or another or the Heat, this is a good trade because or even the Nuggets, right? 2 of the top seeds just made themselves worse, but I absolutely hate this trade. And it is worth noting, I will have to go into depth at some point where like Kristaps Porzingis, the reason like I was looking at like BPM and win shares, and he's considered a good player. And the reason those stats are remedial is those stats had the value of the box score eyeballed by the person making it, whereas the wins produced stat adjusts against league average. And if you do not adjust against league average, you cannot know how good a player is, because the NBA is a constantly evolving league. Teams did not shoot as well from 3 as recently as 10 years ago as they do now. The NBA, I think, unlike other sports, still has room to grow for improvement, and it has been improving. And that's just worth noting. Like, I mean, I think there might be something to be said for the toughness angle. Namely, I do think a lot of the wear and tear from the 80s would shred a lot of modern players, but it shredded a lot of players in the 80s. I think that the NBA is in a better place there, but I think modern teams are just better than classical teams. That's just the way it goes. And so that's the thing. You cannot be using a stat that was developed in 2006 by Dean Oliver eyeballing something, or even as recently as I think BPM was early 2010s. As recently as that, you cannot be using those stats when the league has evolved and changed, because then when you're looking and it says, hey, this stat says this player is good. And you're like, well, they're not, because the league has changed. They would have been good when the stat was made. They are no longer good.
Yeah, this is not a great trade for the Celtics. I think it's fine for the Wizards. Like Tyus Jones is fine. They get off of Porzingis, right? That's the important thing. And they wanted to get him gone. I like it for Memphis as well. I think what they're going to do is just say, Marcus Smart, you're just going to replace Dillon Brooks, and Dillon Brooks is gone. So that's a really big upgrade for them. Also, Marcus Smart can play point guard, of course, in addition to being able to play other positions. So if something happened with Ja Morant, he can't go for whatever reason. He's got kind of a weird off the court situation going. Let's not dig into that. But if something weird happens with Ja Morant, Marcus Smart can play point guard too. So I'm okay with it for the Grizzlies. Yeah, Celtics. So I'm going to contradict myself from the last show we talked about the Celtics, where I said basically their offense isn't good enough. They need some more offensive minded players. Well, Porzingis is not the guy. Like you said, he has a reputation, but he's just not efficient enough. And I think his defense is looking poor these days too. He's over 7 feet tall. He's had all those injuries. I don't think he's a switchable defender these days, despite being a decent rim protector. So, yeah, I mean, maybe between him and Rob Williams, if Rob Williams stays, they'll have enough health at the center position. But then when you go to a less defensive player like Porzingis at center, then also lose Marcus Smart, maybe they're going too far in the other direction, losing too much defense. So we'll see. It seems like Jaylen Brown is just going to get a supermax deal, which we are also not fans of. But maybe that's enough to, get him better. Like Tatum is still really good, and I think he's the guy he's going to carry the Celtics as far as, he can go, or however that saying goes.
I still, it sounds weird. I still think there's an outside shot of Brown for Lillard.
Oh, that would be good.
It's still too much in the bubbling phase, but there is that, the Damian Lillard off of Portland. We get this every offseason, and that might be one reason I'm not taking it as seriously. But it's starting to like gain a little more heat, where they're saying, hey, he's not going to be back like this time for real. So I could still see something there, but we'll just have to wait. I mean, it's really hard. We use poker metaphors on this show a lot. And one of the things you brought up is when you're looking at younger players like Jordan Poole, you're like, well, they could be good. And Patrick and I know in poker, we go for, yeah, you don't want to bet when you are behind. You want to bet when you are ahead or when it's cheap. And so from a Boxscore Geeks perspective, that has just always been antithetical to how we would build a team. You go, if I can invest in Jordan Poole for $5 million a season and in 3 years see what I've got, I'll do that. Absolutely. But if it's like, if I have to invest $30 million in Jordan Poole and wait 3 seasons to see if it's worth it, I absolutely hate that. Same thing, right? With the Celtics. Yeah, Kristaps Porzingis, change of scenery, change of coaching scheme, might be good. He is, like you did note, they do need offense. So there is that, but that, and I guess arguably he pulls Al Horford out. So I mean, it might be kind of a wash. So that's kind of an interesting point I hadn't thought of. But it's just like, I don't want to risk 40 million of my salary cap on a player that might be good. I hate that logic, right? Like, you should spend money on veterans that are productive. You should bet on upside, like to the point you were making about the Warriors. One of the things I really like about what they did in the draft is they drafted for production. They drafted for upside. Like
older players as well.
Yeah, people could say, hey, why didn't the Warriors draft for need, right? You're like, they need a center. Why did they draft 2 centers? And then Dunleavy said it right. We're not going to play any player from the draft as a real player. So we might as well go for the player that might be a star in 2 or 3 seasons and take over for Draymond or take over for Chris Paul. Or, yeah, that's weird to say. I had a typo and I was like, oh, he does play on that team. Take over for Chris Paul.
That's right.
Take over for Steph Curry. That's where we go for. By the way, the one last trade, and then I'll let us end up on the draft, and that can be the show, Brian. It's good to be back. But the Hawks send John Collins to the Jazz, and the Hawks get back Rudy Gay. This is just a salary dump. It's kind of interesting in that John Collins is a player that when he was younger, we actually really liked. I think it's got to be age and injury. He hasn't been good in a while. I think the last few
He just
seasons
hasn't been on the court a lot.
Here's what's rough. It was 2,100 minutes this season, but that's following a 1,600 minute and an 1,800 minute and a 1,300. Like, this is the first season he's cracked 2,000 minutes in his NBA career. But that's the irony, right? Is it's like after all of these injuries, he finally is able to stay on the court, and he is just not the player he was even as recently as 3 or 4 years ago. Good news is he'll probably see an altitude boost from being in Utah. But I mean, this is kind of a meh trade all around because I think the Utah Jazz win it in that they get a better player than they sent out. But then he's going to cost money. But I don't see the Jazz or the Hawks doing much of anything next season. So it's kind of a meh trade. And those are our major trades, Brian. 2 of them involve Chris Paul.
Yeah. I mean, when you're one of those teams like the Jazz who's absorbing the salary, you're almost always going to win the trade, right? You have all the leverage there. John Collins is interesting because their front court right now is, of course, Walker Kessler, the 7-footer. And then they also have Markkanen, who used to be a center, played power forward last year and had a big breakthrough season. But then he played small forward for the Cavaliers before that. So I guess they're going to put Markkanen back to small forward and do the super big again. So, yeah, we'll see what happens there. Bobby Marks had an interesting comment about this. Like, he's a guy that, we look to because he actually has front office experience and understands how trades and the salary cap works. He's like, this trade is a sign of the new CBA, that even a team like the Hawks, who barely scrapped, into the play-in round, they have to salary dump. I mean, it's a punitive CBA now. The times are changing.
Yeah. And I mean, it's just something to keep in mind for anybody that does like the LeBron versus MJ litmus test, which is to say the modern NBA keeping a dynasty together is much harder than it has ever been. And that is not necessarily a problem, but it is just saying that's the state of the world. So, Brian, I don't have much to say on the NBA draft except the following. This is interesting. I went to Strictly Data Science, which is the Strictly Data Science Twitter of Arturo Galletti, who you can find on Twitter as American Numbers. Maybe he'll be on Blue Sky. By the way, if you are on Blue Sky, I'm Nerd Numbers on Blue Sky. So thank you very much for that. Let me give the proper thanks. So Chris Hansen is the person who shared that, a Suns fan. So Chris Hansen shared that. I'm over on Blue Sky. Thanks for that. Really appreciate that, Chris. And yeah, if you want to find me on Blue Sky, and we'll see in the future. But Strictly Data Science, he did his draft projection. And what was really fascinating is when I was going through the top draft picks, they looked, at least at the top of the draft, they looked pretty good. I think Scooter Henderson, they switched, right? Like it was like Miller and Henderson. I think it was like who was going to go 2, who was going to go 3. Actually, yeah. Brian, I forgot. I have my one.
Yeah, Arturo did have Scoot as number 2, and I think most people did.
I do have my one draft take, and then I'll let you talk the draft, and that can be the show.
Mm-hmm.
Bob Bulgaris, formerly of the Mavericks front office, interesting cat and a person that I actually do have liked some of his takes. It's interesting because it's one of these.
He was famous for gambling takes like 10 years ago, right before he went into the league.
Yeah, he made a lot of money betting on the Lakers to win it all, and I think 2001. Poker player, popular gambler, has said that Doc Rivers has cost him millions, so respect him for that.
Oh.
Interesting player, and that interesting person, and that like some of the reputation. This is a weird case to be in. I have not seen anything about his reputation that I can definitively pin down with Google searches or whatever. And there are random ones that I'm like, I don't know, but I'll stick out, and then it's always hard to know in those situations. But he brought up that Shams was talking about how there was real consideration about how, the number 2 team was changing their mind and considering another person, right? They were like, Charlotte is really giving a strong consideration to Scoot Henderson instead of Brandon Miller. And he also works, or has, like, the company he works with has contracts with the sports books, with DraftKings and FanDuel. And
interesting.
Well, Garris is like, this guy just said stuff that moved the line. which is going to cause people to bet. And that's going to help the sports books. And we really need to think about that. And for those that have forgotten the glory days or the ancient days, whatever you want to call it, of DFS, there was a scandal around an employee at DraftKings who basically was an employee at DraftKings playing on FanDuel, and he had access to player data. So this gets really weird because player is a nebulous term. Basically, he could see what bettors were doing on DraftKings. And he could take that betting data and go over to FanDuel, and arguably that's an unfair edge. And I don't need, it's very much like the old quiz shows where I'm not even sure if there's anything strictly illegal, but there's definitely something questionable about that. And now we're in a position where a lot of the leagues are in bed with the sports books advertising wise. And now we're going, what happens when an advertising company like ESPN or Yahoo has a pundit that can move the line that also has, contracts with that? And I saw a couple of people bring that up, that might be a problem, because you could bet on the draft. You could bet on the draft at DraftKings, appropriately named, I guess. And you have a pundit that's moving the line that was not true, right? Like he was like, Charlotte's given serious consideration to Scoot Henderson, and they still drafted Brandon Miller. I think I was like the only major, I was going to say this, I think I was the only major trade when I was looking at the top of the draft and looking at Arturo's numbers. A lot of them really lined up with players he really liked. So I don't know if I have anything to say there. I think it was until Detroit or the Magic, right? I think like the first 4 picks were like all his, and even after that, they were players he liked. So I wonder if front offices actually are getting savvier at drafting.
One comment I noticed he made is that he is now using scouting, weighting scouting heavier in his model than he used to. So maybe that's could be part of it, but honestly, that's just a brief comment. I don't know a lot about his model, so I don't want to comment too much. In terms of the players, yeah, I mean Wembanyama and Scoot Henderson, of course, are big time prospects. Wembanyama, people think maybe the biggest since LeBron, and Scoot Henderson maybe would be a number 1 type of prospect in other years. We've talked about Wembanyama a lot. He's very young. He did have turnovers and inefficiency playing in a pro league. We'll see what happens. Scoot is interesting. He's already played 2 years of pro basketball now in the G League, even though he's really young. I don't think his numbers were very good. I have watched him play quite a bit, and he's pretty fun to watch. People think he's like Russell Westbrook, which I think is a good comparison. Just kind of a big guy with point guard skills that can really get to the basket, but might need to work on his shot. Brandon Miller actually had pretty good numbers in college. So there's a lot more there for people like us to look at in terms of just scouting. He had really good defensive numbers. He was a really good 3-point shooter. He models his game after Paul George, he says, which is kind of interesting. He said Paul George is the GOAT. He's better than LeBron. So interestingly, though, he seems to be more, to me, like power forward Paul George than shooting guard Paul George. He's a little bit bigger and less athletic, I think, a little more of a rim protector than Paul George, but he can shoot the ball. So he's an interesting player. Just a few others I noticed in terms of the numbers. The Thompson twins, both of them were really good in college, really good numbers. They're also known as defensive specialists, so they can't shoot as well. Players like that always jump out to me, of course. And I mean, great reference to the 80s band, the Thompson Twins, who were not twins, unlike these Thompson twins now. They were actually 3 people unrelated to each other, but named after the Tintin characters Thompson and Thompson, who are twins. Anyway.
I'll say this. That's what we need. The NBA has 2 active Thompsons and 10 Thompsons in their history, including David Skywalker Thompson for the Denver Nuggets. The best.
Yeah.
He took the first pitch equivalent, like the first 3 throw in the game I went and saw, which was
that's
really cool.
Awesome. That's awesome. Yeah, so I'm trying to think. There's probably a few other guys. I mean, both of the guys that the Warriors got, I talked about earlier, they were both 2 of Arturo's top 10 players, but fell down really far in the draft. So yeah, it's clear to me the Warriors are following data these days.
Yeah, I mean, and like I said, there's sorry. All of my draft takes are boring because I'm just like, we don't know. They're young. We'll have to wait and see. Most of these players will flame out, which is fine. That is what's supposed to happen. That's what happens every year. A top 10 player in the NBA dictates your success. there are only, let's see, 15 active roster spots, so 450 active spots in the NBA. So 10 out of 450, that's horrible odds to begin with. And every year we get 60 new players in the NBA, usually maybe more like 55, sometimes some of them don't play in the NBA via the draft. So it's like, yeah, there cannot, like, all of these draft picks can't even win. You're lucky to get one or two of them turning into a top 10 player, which is what everybody's looking for. But what I was going to know.
Can I add one thing on that?
Go
Super
for it.
interesting. There is, however, a new three-way spot this year for every team. So each team has two-way spot. Each team has 3 two-way spots instead of 2 now. So there's 30 more roster spots for the pool of players now, basically, which is really interesting. In fact, the reason why Jackson Davis fell to the Warriors is apparently they gave him a promise. They said, all the other teams that were talking to him, they said, we want to make you a 3-way player. The Warriors said, no, we're going to give you a 3-year deal as a second-round pick. And so his agent did not take calls from those other teams, and he was able to follow the Warriors. So that roster spot thing you're talking about matters a lot, and it affects the draft.
It's also interesting, like something that amuses me about the draft and like the combine is that really you could do the old Bill Russell trick. So for those that don't know, Bill Russell, there's an award named after him, the Finals MVP, one of the greatest ever. Red Auerbach, the GM of the Celtics, didn't see him play and just drafted him based on reputation and scouting. And in the modern NBA, with all the data we have, I really do fall for, like, they don't want to work out with your team. They don't want to come to the combine, whatever. Who cares? You have enough data to go off of to make your pick. So it always amuses me. And I mean, that was like a case towards the end, I remember, with Rob Hinkey and the 76ers, is that, I think Kristaps Porzingis, like, his agent said, I'm not going to let him work out with you. And the answer is, well, the draft, I get your rights. If I draft you, it doesn't matter. So it does amuse me that a really good player that the Warriors have faith in, that is a Moneyball story you just told there, by the way, where they basically call a guy and are like, come with us and we'll give you this. Very much like the Hatterberg scene in the actual movie itself, where they're like, we'll do this, but you have to, keep it on the down low and all that. It amuses me that teams just don't go, hey, you look good on paper. Who cares if your agent won't talk to us? We'll draft you anyway. But good on the Warriors for that paying off for them. And the only other last point is, if you look at the top of the draft, and I actually tweeted about this, I think 5 of the top 7 picks were not out of the NCAA. We had like 2 from the Jeep Elite. We had Wembanyama and one of his teammates. We had, I think, 1 from Ignite and 2 from, I forget the other league, like the Octane League or something is what it's called.
That's right, yeah.
And that's wild. That is really wild to see the top of the draft not be reliant on the NCAA. So when you watch the NCAA like flailing about like NIL rights and all that, and then you also look at where the players are coming from, like, it'll take a while to die. It'll take a really, really long time to die because there are billions of dollars still behind it. There is an entrenched infrastructure. You still have lots of players whose parents went to school that'll want to go there or represent. But it's a new world. It is a brave new world. And when I wrote an article last year talking about how, if you looked for superstar players, right? Because if you look at Nikola Jokic and Giannis Antetokounmpo, they're not draft picks. They're international players that were missed. And I was basically going, in the old days, when you're drafting Hakeem Olajuwon and Michael Jordan, you have 3rd and 4th year college players where college is really the only acceptable other league in the world beyond the NBA to pick from. And now that it's worldwide and we have these international leagues, we have, the G League itself, we have these amateur, I'll put in quote amateur, but they get paid, so whatever I call that, minor leagues in the North America. Drafting has just gotten a heck of a lot harder. So it's a very interesting thing to say. The old model of going for all NCAA has changed. And not only that, I was saying it's really hard to find stars when the data is so noisy, and the data just got a whole lot noisier.
Yeah, and one of, if not the top player for this upcoming season, Ron Holland, is already going to the G League, and I think many others are as well. If you want to be a professional, why not just go about being a professional? That's the way I look at it.
Well, really, take that money.
Like, why are you going to go to class when you need to develop your game? I'm sorry.
if you could make $100,000 in a minor league team, take that $100,000, put it in the bank, and you can use it to go to school later. Like, there's no reason you would take a salary. You would take a scholarship over a salary at this point. All right. Anyway, Brian, that's all I got. Any other comments on the draft? Anything to end up on? Otherwise, that can be our show, and hopefully we'll be back to same bat time in 2 weeks.
No, I don't have too much more in the draft other than, yeah, I mean, I came to a little bit late, but I spent a few days reading over the players. They all seem great, and even if they won't contribute this next year, in the next 2 or 3 years, I'm excited for some of them. Players that are coming out now are a lot more like the kind of players that we like, I think, in a lot of cases.
Love it. All right. So I've got 2 shout outs, Brian. I'll shout out the, if you go to patreon.com/Jeff May, the Nerd Podcast is over there. That's the other podcast I do, Brian. And the good news is you've been on that show as well. So this month's has dropped, which was Gremlins 2. We're doing batshit insane sequels.
Gremlins 2, the new batch? Is that the new batch? Oh,
Gremlins
my goodness.
2, the new batch. We're basically talking about like sequels that just took a complete departure from the first movie. So Gremlins 2 and Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle 2 are both on the docket for this. And Brian has been on that show on the Magic the Gathering show, which, shocker, goes into metadata, games, drafting, game theory, all the stuff you've come to expect here. So the Nerd Podcast on the Jeff Has Cool Friends feed, one of my favorites that just dropped. And I just have to throw this because it came across my feed. Ohtani just had a 10 strikeout home run. So he hit home run as a designated hitter, got 10 strikeouts as the pitcher for the Los Angeles Angels. Absolutely ridiculous. And a funny note I'll give you, Brian, is recently the Colorado Rockies were on the cusp of becoming a all-time history record. The most number of runs given up in a game is 30. The Rockies gave up 25. And here's the thing, Ryan. I am less surprised that the Rockies gave up 25 runs than that in that game, Mike Trout and Ohtani combined for a grand total of 1 home run with 0 going to Ohtani, who is currently leading Major League Baseball in home runs as a designated hitter pitcher. What is this world?
That was a weird game. People were thinking that was somehow going to become a tungsten arm O'Doyle game at the end, but that didn't happen, of course. So someone has a meme out there that even when Trout and Ohtani hit 1 million home runs, the Angels still lose. They still lose by 8 runs. And, Ohtani hasn't done something since 100 years ago when tungsten arm O'Doyle did it, who's a fake old-timey pitcher.
Well, I mean, and by the way, for what it's worth, the good news is that the Los Angeles Angels just added a run to hopefully not do that. But yeah, like Ohtani got 10 strikeouts as a pitcher, exited in the 6th as the pitcher, as the designated hitter, and hit a home run. And the Angels could still lose this. So yeah, it's just like,
I'm not really following baseball anymore, Dre. Is Ohtani going to be like the highest North American paid athlete ever because he pitches and hits and baseball players get paid a lot? Like, is that going to happen?
I heard he's up for $500 to $600 million, although, I think
and these are like 8-year deals, right? These are really long deals.
I would say NBA is getting wild, right? As I noted in the article, Devin Booker and Bradley Beal are going to combine for over $400 million of the Suns over the next 4 years. But yeah, to your point, basketball has shorter contracts. Football is non-guaranteed. I think, baseball is where the highest contracts are. And I think I was seeing something where Ohtani is probably up to $500 to $600 million on his next contract, which is,
and I say North American because I assume European soccer pays the most, but I don't know for sure.
Yeah, those soccer contracts and then they get wild too, where like you can be highly paid and they pay to like borrow you if your team is bad, not in the playoffs. Soccer's an entirely different beast. All right, Brian, any shout outs from you, or I can leave us right into outros?
No, let's do it.
All right, this has been the Boxscore Geeks show. If you want to find the stats, check boxscoregeeks.com. Periodically, I write at nerdnumbers.substack.com. You can find Brian and myself on the socials. Myself as Nerd Numbers. Brian, if you get a Blue Sky account, are you going to keep the Boxscore Brian moniker?
Yeah, good question. I don't know. It might be taken over there.
I doubt it. It's still wild.
Maybe I can just be Brian. I don't know. We'll see what happens.
Oh, if you can get Brian, I'm pretty
Probably
sure Brian's
not.
taken, but if you can get Brian, take Brian. But you can find Brian on Twitter as Boxscore Brian, and we'll try and stick around in the socials so you can find us. You can find us anywhere that podcasts are found, the Boxscore Geek Show. We go live typically Tuesday night, 10 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, twitch.tv/nerd numbers every other week. And you can find recaps of those channel Nerd Numbers. That's at Nerd Numbers at YouTube. I think that's everything, Brian. Go Nuggets. Go Warriors. We'll see you next week.